it took some pushing, it took some prodding on your part, on the part of Professor Rubenstein and the other one, Rouillard, getting out there and saying, look, we've this whole thing that's been going on. There's a lot of pieces that don't fit, or there's a lot of discussion that's not happening, or a lot of assumptions are being made about what happened that aren't accurate. And finally, it seems to hit a tipping point, though, where we're having a public discussion on what actually happened with these residential schools and these burial sites.
Yeah, it's interesting how what we've been doing. A group of us have been digging into the issue and publishing our findings. At the beginning, we were pretty much frozen out of what you might call the legacy media or corporate media. We published in, let's call it alternative media, like Western Standard, True North, Dorchester Review. It's a small historical journal. And we published quite a bit of stuff, putting forth a different interpretation about the unmarked graves. Finally, last week, we had a bit of a breakthrough into the legacy media. There was a big spread in National Post. I expect many of your viewers have seen that, by Terry Glavin, front page, and not only front page, but several internal pages. I mean, much larger than any newspaper normally grants space to an author. So it was really quite a landmark. And in addition to that, there was coverage in the New York Post, which is the oldest newspaper in the United States, and in several Quebec newspapers. So it's a bit of a landmark for us in trying to broaden the discussion, and we hope there will be lots more.
Yeah, and I don't like driving too many of our viewers to other outlets, but that's okay. I mean, Glavin's piece was outstanding, and as you said, it's rare when you get such a long one, particularly in a print medium. I mean, that takes. I would imagine there was a lot of discussion before going into something that controversial and going that deep between the editors. Like, do we want to go there? Do we want to give him this much ink on this issue? And it's happy to see that they did.
Yeah, I'm sure it was discussed. It's also interesting that about a year ago, Mr. Glavin published a much shorter column about the findings in Kamloops, which took a sort of a conventional point of view that, yes, these were unmarked graves and wasn't it terrible, and on and on and on. So he's really reversed himself over the course of the year. He doesn't say why. Perhaps the publications of our group have had something to do with that. I don't care where it comes from, but the point is that now a different view of this is getting a wider audience, and I think that's terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we don't ever want to punish people for just admitting, even if he didn't go into the admitting he was wrong, but just changing the view. Hey, if he's changing correctly, then good on him. And as you said, maybe it was because of reading, and there was some stuff in the Dorchester Times as well that really dug into that a fair amount too.
Well, that's right. Professor Rouillard's article was a bit of a bombshell. I mean, it got, well, I haven't looked at the number recently, but at one time it was way over 100,000 hits for something published put up on the website of a fairly small circulation historical journal. It's absolutely unprecedented. And that showed that there was a hunger for getting the truth about these so-called unmarked graves. So we've been working on it ever since, and I think we're making a little progress. But the politicians are deeply invested in the story. I mean, the Prime Minister with his half-mast flags, and now he's got the Governor General talking about it as well. It's going to be hard for them to climb down because they have made such an ostentatious display of allegiance to a story for which there are, in fact, no supporting facts. I repeat, absolutely no facts. Not one burial has been found with all the hype and publicity. Ground penetrating radar has found some soil disturbances, which could conceivably be burials, particularly when they go looking in cemeteries. It's not surprising that they might come up with a burial, but absolutely no evidence that any of these are burials of so-called missing children. So it's I repeat, it's the biggest fake news story in my lifetime. Perhaps since the New York Times cover-up of the Holocaust in the Ukraine and this mass starvation in the Ukraine, I guess, was a bigger fake news story. But this is a big one.
Well, and a very socially damaging one. A lot of people took that to heart. And I mean, a lot of people were horrified if you read it on the surface when it initially was breaking. And if you believe that that's what was happening, that they were really abusing these children en masse and hiding the burials. I mean, it's mortifying. And correcting the record later, but a lot of the damage in trust and emotion and things that has happened. Like, where do you go to start recovering from this?
No, I know what you mean, Corey. Tremendous damage has been done. First, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission accusing Canada of cultural genocide, and now with the claims about unmarked graves, it sort of moves into a literal physical genocide. And unless you read these stories very carefully, they are horrifying. Now, if you read carefully, you start to see details that don't add up, like claims that 6-year-olds were uh, rousted out of bed in the middle of the night to go dig graves, and that babies were thrown into furnaces, and the bodies were seen hanging on meat hooks in the barn. A lot of these details, um, they go beyond the unlikely into the realm of the virtually impossible. But not everybody researches stories that carefully, and how can they? People have busy lives and they look at the headlines. So yeah, tremendous harm has been done already.
Yeah, and anecdotal evidence, I mean, it really has to be examined, particularly when it's verbal and with such emotional matter. I mean, the people saying some of those stories might have heard them from somewhere and a friend of a friend, but that shouldn't be making newsprint unless you can verify things like that, something that horrific. Um,
This for people with long memories, and maybe you have to be a little bit gray-haired for this, but remember the moral panic about daycare centers, and there was all kinds of testimony about awful sexual assaults taking place in daycare centers, and people went to jail for it. Fortunately, nobody was executed. uh, and it all turned out to be complete nonsense. Overheated imaginations of children being asked leading questions. A lot of the details in these stories are actually reminiscent of the daycare center moral panics, and there are some. We haven't got time to explore it today, but there are some actual historical linkages between those stories and the ones that we hear now.
well, and I think perhaps a little bit of both is what more emotional area can you get than the care and safety of your children? In both cases, it's something that really gets people fearful and empathizing. I mean, you can imagine if somebody else's child is abused, you're horrified as well on their behalf.
Yeah, absolutely, and you understand why people react to it. But when you look analytically at it, what's happening here is, well, so-called oral tradition. It's always, not somebody who saw these things, but somebody who talked to somebody who saw these things. That's that kind of testimony, which gets passed down and gets exaggerated. It's like the game of telephone where you whisper around a circle and the story keeps changing as it gets carried on. So, but to come back to the starting point here, I think what's really important is the complete irresponsibility of the corporate or legacy media who picked up these stories as soon as they came out and started to run with them and did not ask elementary questions that any good researcher would ask, like what is the factual evidence for these claims? The New York Times, for heaven's sake, supposed to be the leading newspaper in the world, published a story about mass graves in Kamloops. Exaggeration upon exaggeration, and these are supposed to be the leading parts of our news media. I mean, I say thank God for outlets like the Western Standard, which are not part of this. No, that's really the I think the story for today is the complete irresponsibility of the legacy media on this story. Now, will they correct themselves? Uh, Self-correction is not a common feature of human beings, Corey. So
No,
none of us like to admit when we've been wrong, but they were absolutely wrong.
Professor Rubenstein, asking this. This was a few months ago. Why can't we find Canada's missing residential school students? And we published that, and it was well written and well sourced, and it did okay. But we also got some pushback, some negative emails saying, "Oh, you guys, you're trying to, deny a tragedy," and otherwise it just didn't boom. I mean, some of the incentive for even smaller media outlets or bigger is the sensational, the horror is going to grab you the clicks, and it's so measurable now with digital that I think they feel inclined to they want to sensationalize the horror of this, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, the pushback is starting now in the legacy media. There was an editorial today in the Winnipeg Free Press or not an editorial, but a guest column by Negan Sinclair, who's the son of Murray Sinclair. He's the younger Sinclair is a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. But he embarrassed himself by going on a long rant, which has no factual content at all. It's political rather than professorial. He doesn't deal in logic and fact. It's a long exercise in name calling. I'm too old, I'm too old, I'm too white, et cetera, et cetera. It's really an embarrassment for somebody who's employed by the public as a professor to be putting out that kind of argument. But that kind of abuse is going to come. I think there will be a lot of pushback of that type. But we're going to keep plugging away and presenting fact and try and make yard by yard a little progress.
Well, and the facts are there. I mean, there was somewhere when I had Professor Rubenstein on this show before, and I had stated actually in a question saying, well, it must be hard, there couldn't be many records from the schools from back then and things like that. And he said, oh, no, it's very well documented where the children were, where they were transferred. And in fact, these schools, that's the way they got paid. If you didn't document who you had and where they were, even if you're just looking on the self-interest level, they had every interest in documenting it, and those documents still exist. We can find out who passed away where and where they were buried or who went home. There's no missing children.
Well, absolutely. I mean, to take one example, the claim is that possibly 200 or 215 unmarked graves were discovered at Kamloops. Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself compiled a list of 51 children who died while attending the school at Kamloops. Well, that's over a period of more than 100 years for the largest residential school in Canada. I mean, that's not a lot of fatalities. All deaths are sad, but in 100 years and at a time when there were no antibiotics and tuberculosis and other diseases were killers of children, it's not a huge total. Anyway, 51, not 200, 51 deaths were documented at the school. And death certificates are available for these children in the archives of the province of British Columbia. But the TRC didn't look there. So you get the implication that there's something wrong with these deaths. Well, the death certificate showed that what did they die of? Well, tuberculosis, tragically, sometimes runaways, got accidents. Most of them were sent back for burial to their home reserves. Again, contrary to what is often said. There are no missing children. They're all accounted for. The whole missing children thing is a fable based upon misuse or overlooking historical sources that are there. It's really a disgrace that the TRC spent so much public money and ended up generating so many legends without making proper use of sources that would have been readily available to it.
Yeah, and I mean, the investigation even at the time, it was surprising out of journalism because I mean, you still to a degree you want to get those scoops and things like that, like with the famous, or you could almost call it infamous picture of Trudeau kneeling with the teddy bear at a cemetery and his head down, the photo opportunity. And that one was covered in Glavin's story as well. It was countered immediately. They're saying this is a known cemetery. There was nothing discovered here. This was all documented. Why didn't they counter Trudeau at the time? Say, dude, you're
Well, yeah, that's right. Many of the more responsible Indigenous leaders got out right away and said, look, these are cemeteries. Of course, you're going to find burials there, but they're not necessarily from a residential school. But, Mr. Trudeau, unfortunately, is impervious to facts, and he sees an opportunity to display emotion, and he takes advantage of it. So, and you can't blame citizens when they see their prime minister and the governor general pushing this story, and all the legacy media are pushing it, and Indigenous leaders are pushing it. You can't blame ordinary people for believing it. So we've got an uphill struggle here to get the facts out. But as I say, we do think we're making a little progress. Yeah,
well, people, themselves, your average people are busy. They're only going to research so far. They read the media so that theoretically they're getting information without having to do all that. That's supposed to be our job to get out there. So you're still working on this with some other individuals and digging into this?
Yes, we are. We're publishing wherever we can, sometimes in the alternative media. We'd love to break into the legacy media on this issue. We're still, I think, shut out. But Terry Glavin got in there. Now, Glavin has an advantage. He doesn't have the reputation of being a conservative. I don't know what his politics are. They're hard to pin down, but he certainly is kind of an independent. So I guess that gave him an advantage in telling the story, and I think that's great. Uh, that shows that this goes beyond. It's got nothing to do with ideology, really. It's not whether you're conservative or liberal. It's whether you are able to establish historical fact.
Yeah, Glavin has no political agenda, and that always does help in that case. And not to say that you do or Mr. Rouillard or anybody else, but yourself, you've been very politically involved in the past, and people could use that to claim that this is got some sort of political motivation. So, but again, the more voices getting it out there and basing it on fact, the better. So, good to see you guys are still at it, and the cracks are showing in the legacy media. They're starting to accept this now.
Yeah, I think so. We'll see how it goes. It's not going to be easy. It never is. And there'll be a lot of abuse showered down on us along the way. But as I say, this is not really a political issue. It's a factual, historical issue. And I would hope that all people of intelligence and goodwill can agree upon historical evidence and historical fact and can recognize fake news when they see it.
Well, I appreciate the work you've been doing and the work you're going to carry on doing. I hope we can talk again soon as more information surfaces. Maybe we could it's going to take a while, but we can correct this wrong and maybe set an example so we don't see something like this happen again.
Okay, well, thanks for looking into the story, Corey. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.